Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to another edition of the Liberty Report with Adam Mad Maxwell from Liberty. I guess you have a new group now. What is it? What is the name of the group again?
Rising group. Just we're having some Telegram specific platform issues. That's it. Yeah.
His link is in the description in my channel, and I believe in his channel as well. His link tree is there. So as long as he updates the link tree, you'll be able to get to his Telegram group. Join the Gonzalez Legacy group and the Straight Talk podcast Telegram channel to keep up to date with news and when we go live, as well as that's linked also to the official Professor Red Pill Telegram channel. Thank you for joining us on Rumble, on Locals, YouTube, or CensorTube as I call it, Twitch, and our affiliates. That being said, today we're talking about the Soviet Union collapse. This is like our historical debate, discussion. We're going to get into it. Basically, is that I honestly thought about this. I was teaching Georgian history and culture last semester. As you guys know, I'm a professor, associate professor, fairly prestigious university in the Caucasus, and and I do this as part time in addition to my tutelage in my research and academia. But anyway, the reality is that from what I've talked to in the empirical studies, as well as my communication with people that were working in the Soviet Union, pre-Soviet peoples that I've come in contact over my travels through a lot of the post-Soviet countries. There is a consensus that they believe that the Soviet Union did not collapse due to any type of economic reality is that there was some bad situation there, and we're going to get into it, but more or less, like, they believe it was an inside job by the elites, by Gorbachev especially. That being said, Adam, what are your thoughts? When you're unmuted, by the way. It's all good.
Thank you. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 without foreign invasion.
Shot being
without
fired, yeah.
without a lost total war, and without a mass revolutionary overthrow of the ruling elite. In 1985, the USSR was a nuclear superpower. It controlled half of Europe. How did a superpower with nuclear power, internal security organs, and formal ideologically legitimacy voluntarily disassemble? It had to have been an inside job, not necessarily as a conspiratorial framework. Maybe we'll get to that, but just objectively, it wasn't an external disintegration as they're trying to do to Russia today. Another topic. It was an internal and an inside job.
Yeah, I mean, basically, when people talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, they describe it like an accident, like the system just failed and fell apart on its own. But that's not what happened. The Soviet Union wasn't defeated in a war, like you said. It wasn't overthrown by a popular revolution like the Bolshevik Revolution that created the Soviet Union or the Soviet Empire. So there was no final uprising, and instead it was a dismantled form of inside by its own leadership. So it was dismantled within the framework of the leadership. So in March of 91, the Soviet people voted in a national referendum. And this is important, guys. This is key. Nearly 3/4 voted to preserve the Soviet Union in the reformed vote. And this was a consensus of the populations. So 9 months later, it was gone. Like it just ended. And not because the people demanded it, but simply because small groups of elites signed it out of existence behind closed doors. And still today, that's very secretive, and we don't know exactly what went on in that. But we do know that Gorbachev basically wanted to modernize and westernize the Soviet republics and Soviet Union as a whole. So that tells us something important, that basically systems don't always collapse because they stop working. They collapse when elites decide they're no longer worth saving. We've seen this, numerous amount of empires have collapsed in the past. So more importantly, Gorbachev's reforms were supposed to fix the system, as I said previously, but instead they basically hollowed it out. People were not used to a new system of economics and a new system of governance. Republics were starting to leave. Germany, Eastern Germany gained its independence, then followed by Czech Republic or Yugoslavia, and now it's broken up into, it's basically balkanized and broke up into several different countries that we know today. I think all of them are EU countries now. So basically, instead they hollowed it out. So economic controls were removed without a functional market. Political authority was weakened without replacing it with legitimacy. And this result wasn't freedom, but basically a power vacuum. And that's what I talked about previously in previous podcasts, as well as on the Telegram channel, links in the description, as I talk about these power vacuums. So who filled that power vacuum, basically? So the same insiders who ran the system before. As we know today, oligarchs. That's what we refer to them as, Russian oligarchs or post-Soviet oligarchs. And these are the individuals that gained a lot of power and a lot of influence after its collapse. They had a moral hazard, basically, is what, if you refer back to the CDO crisis. They had a reason to collapse the system and consolidate. So they had a lot to benefit from this. So state assets didn't disappear. It wasn't like they just poof, gone. No, they still existed. There were still the factories. There was still land, infrastructure, oil, minerals, gas, and all the things that we say today. Previous neocons, some are not living anymore, once referred to the Soviet or current Russian state or Russian Federation as, was it a gas station posing as a country? If I got that quote correctly, I don't know. I digress. Anyway, so ordinary citizens basically lost savings, stability, and security. They lost their pensions, basically. And you still, when I talk to a lot of the post-Soviet people that paid into these pensions, they were like, yeah, I got nothing. Basically, the only thing they got was the apartment that they were living in. That was a government housing unit that was given to them as part of their citizenry. And that's all they got out of it, basically. There were individuals that kept going to work, even during the Soviet collapse. Like I said, in all the different republics and different countries, people still went to work. Things were still running. A lot of people didn't believe that it collapsed. A lot of people didn't believe. They thought it was a psyop. They thought that Gorbachev was just full crap, basically. And they kept going to work. They were like, "Oh no, it's going to get back. The government's going to get. There's going to be a new structure. There's going to be a new committee, and there's going to be a new government. It's going to be just as normal." And that never happened. So elites walked away from ownership. Elites walked away with ownership, basically. And so, why is it an inside job? So it's not a secret conspiracy here, guys, but it was an elite-driven dismantling of a weakened system carried out by people who protected themselves from the fallout. These people, these individuals, and they were an aging demographic of leadership, by the way, not much too dissimilar from the United States and maybe even current Russia for that matter. But we look at a lot of these power elite countries, and they have a significant amount of aging population. I think I've talked about this in the past. If not, this is new. Other influencers have kind of dived into this. You could probably find different stuff on the sensor tubes, but for the most part, we have aging populations, and generally an aging population in the elites or ruling class is usually synonymous with collapse. That's the reality. That's historical fact. So basically, they protected themselves and their families or their connections, and that's the real lesson. Collapse doesn't always look like chaos. It sometimes looks like reform, and sometimes it's managed. And when restructuring happens without public consent, history tells us exactly how that story ends. So that being said, let's get into it.
So there's a couple of key moments here. We've got like 1985 till 91, and then we've got the post-Soviet collapse, this anarchy and actually mafia state. This is post-Soviet collapse. So when you say during the Soviet collapse, there's like this run up to it, and then there's it's collapsed now and takes its place. And there are a lot of consequences that happen there. So, 1985 to 1990 was a period of reformation. You had two key themes, we'll say: perestroika, which is economic restructuring, and glasnost, which is information liberalization. Beyond that, also in 1990, they repealed Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution, which was the monopoly on the Communist Party. So it was no longer a one-party state. Finally, at the end of 1991, with the Belaveja Accords, this dissolved the union by a signature of insiders. Elite-driven, yes. The party security and economic hierarchies eventually, by the end of 91, lost their mandate and coherence from the top down. The state authority was either transferred or abandoned by those legally empowered to preserve it. So structurally, there was an elite decoupling from continuity. The rules were rewritten, the institutions were hollowed out, which left the shell to collapse. Importantly, I don't believe that anyone, like the CIA, didn't expect it to collapse in 91. And they didn't expect it to collapse so quickly either. You got to remember, this was a government, this was a country, right, that survived World War II, survived Lenin and Stalin, and they anticipated they would reform socialism, modernize the industry, they're going to reduce corruption, and of course preserve the union. No one planned the dissolution, and because it wasn't conceivable. Hindsight's 2020, but it didn't begin as a controlled demolition. It was a controlled reform, where perestroika was expanding, state enterprises gained autonomy, kind of information distortions began to surface, but the party controlled the system. It was seen as a correction, not an existential risk. But with the information opening up, like what we're seeing today with some leaks of key government files in the West, glasnost opened these historical wounds. The crimes of the Stalinist regime were able to be discussed more openly. The economic incompetence was exposed. Regional grievances were articulated. The Baltic Republic started mobilizing. The party lost its monopoly on the control narrative, and that was the first irreversible move. Still, at this point, 87, dissolution was not considered. The elites thought maybe there may be some decentralization, but of course it's going to endure. Then, in 1989, Eastern Europe began to revolt. Remember, at this time, the Soviet Union, it's not just Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, and it was Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, all under the Warsaw Pact. It was an empire with satellite states, quite like America is today, with the EU, with various countries in the Pacific, Australia, Five Eyes, Middle East. So you had revolutions in Eastern Europe, and Moscow didn't intervene. For 40 years, Soviet authority rested on its enforcement capability, went in, would crush these with tanks. The world observed that the Red Army did not move. The elite said, better reform than bloodshed. Let's preserve moral legitimacy and avoid those repressions which were characteristic of the 50s and the 60s especially. So the satellites began to move away. Okay, that there wasn't core fragmentation. We're seeing this again today with America and the EU, although I believe America, it appears, still has a firm grip on the whip over their European vassals. But we're kind of seeing some satellites maybe moving away, maybe moving towards China, BRICS, other players. 1990, again, this is where is the legal dissolution, where it was no longer a one-party state. Multi-party politics, Republican sovereignty movements empowered, the central authority diluted. It, again, wasn't controlled collapse. They had an overconfidence. They said, we will remain dominant through legitimacy, not force. But it was a miscalculation, in my understanding, how thin that legitimacy came. So they began as a series of fragmented assertions of sovereignty. So Russia itself, under Yeltsin, declared sovereignty, right? Legal primacy over union law. And again, the elite said, okay, well, this new union treaty will stabilize a looser federation. They still didn't think there's going to be a collapse. Then there's a crisis. Supply chains froze, inflation rises, shortages began to intensify. At this point, the state was beginning to lose administrative coherence. Union negotiations aimed to preserve structure. They still believed a confederation can replace rigid centralization. There was, as far as we know, as far as I'm aware, there was no Politburo meeting in the Kremlin saying, let's dissolve the union. At this point, halfway through the year, there was an attempted coup, August 1991. And this is the important thing. This is what happened with the French Revolution, with the Bolshevik Revolution, with, again, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The military hesitated. The KGB didn't act. The party hesitated. There was a coup, and the center did not coordinate force. They let it happen. From that moment on, from this weakness, this dissolution, that is when collapse became inevitable. Before then, before August 1991, it was unlikely, and after, it was probable. And then that last half of the year, this was the terminal decline, where Ukraine voted independent. Without Ukraine, there's no viable union. All the other states began. They said, all right, we got to either repress everyone or dissolve, and that's when they dissolved. I don't believe anyone really saw it coming, this rapid dissolution into 15 republics. But that's how it was, because the shell was so hollow.
Yeah, I mean, basically, that you broke down all this stuff. I mean, the reality is that I today in the Consolidated Legacy group, I had posted a lot of information about the Weimar Republic and the transition from a oligarch system to basically the Austrian Banner to an authoritarian system. There was a brief period of time known as, like I said, the Weimar Republic. This is when they brought in democracy, changes and social policy, predominantly a liberalization or progressive nature of the Weimar Republic, and this led ultimately to its collapse and the rise of and individuals that we remain nameless at this point. But the reality is that there was aging during the Weimar Republic. There was aging leadership. The elites did not agree with the vast majority of the democratic elected bodies, and there's a lot of there's when you study like these historical policies or historical governments, empires, much like Weimar Republic, Germany, or the Soviet Union, or even the Tsarist Russia. There is a lot of parallels with what's going on in the United States today, and a lot of empires throughout the world. Like I said, the main key point here is we're seeing a progressive liberalization of society. We're seeing a move from family values and core belief systems, and also a shock to the system, because like a lot of the countries, like I said, Russia Federation to an extent is supposedly a capitalist nation. The United States is known as a capitalist state. England is known as a capitalist state, and most of the EU are considered capitalist state. Yet you start seeing in recent times with the push of socialism and communist ideals. And this is the type of economic change that's bringing shock to the system. And not only that, but the progressive change that's sudden and over the last 10, 20 years. Plus we have crisis upon crisis upon crisis. If you guys remember what I said about this before, when you have continual crises, like major crises that happen in a short period of time, just like in the Soviet Union, it leads to collapse because it brings instability. Individuals in charge or the elites in charge are like, well, this might be the opportunity that we are looking for as a scapegoat to get out of this, so that we can take the spoils of war and liquidate and just take as much resources as we can and exit as quickly as we can. And that's what I'm afraid we may see in the future in Europe, America, and globally, these power vacuums that are starting to bubble and create. There is some similarities, like I said, from 1920s, Weimar Republic, American Great Depression, Tsarist Russia, to what's going on currently in the geopolitical landscape and trade and economics. So that's why I brought forth this question, this particular podcast to discussion, because we're seeing this 100-year cycle, if you will. I don't know. What do you think, Adam?
It's fascinating how we are separated by a century from some of these events. Roaring 20s back then, and we're in a collapsing 20s. But also, there is a progressive element to history, I do believe. It's not a dialectical materialism or whatever. It's not Hegelian nonsense. There is a progressive element, meaning a linearity to it, which is technology. So a century ago, I'd like to say there was industrial.
Well, there was point of order there during the Weimar Republic. The technology and innovation and academia was state of the art. Like Germany was actually still the leading technological empire during the 20s. They were much more advanced than the United States or England at that time. So I mean,
it was the leading awesome. In the world. Leading Correct, place in the world was Germany.
So and right now the United States.
And then
Correct, yeah.
following World War I, they're still retaining it, and then it kind of it begun to collapse, and the United States rose up. And of course, you had you had an elite funding of the Soviet Union once it stabilized over there. At the beginning of the 1920s, there was internal war. There was the white versus red, the civil war, which the elites were originally funding. The West, were originally funding the whites, and the Reds were fighting them. Red was obviously the communists. They eventually won. There was famine, all sorts of horrendous stuff until about 1924, war, communism. Then they stabilized. And at this point, as you say, yeah, there was technological innovation and progress everywhere, and this is where there's a progression to it. It was an industrialization, and now we're in the fourth industrial revolution, where it's a digitization. So you did have you had the USSR by the late 20s industrializing. And especially leveling up their agriculture to industry. And now today we're massively kind of EU, especially with the loss of Russian energy, is going from industrialization, it's deindustrializing, and they're trying to move more into digital. But the EU is kind of losing it because of their ideological convictions, pushing towards especially war on the continent, which is foolish.
So I want to point, so that we're on technology, I just want to point a couple facts here. Historical facts. So the Soviet Union, if you remember going back to the space race, the Soviet Union was far more advanced than the United States at the time. And the elites in America were like, how are we going to beat the Soviets? Because they were the first ones to put a satellite. They were the first ones to put a man in the orbit. They had better rocket engines, better technology, propulsion, and things of that nature. And 20 years later, it collapsed. Or 40 years later collapsed, something like that. Within a generation, half a generation. I mean, it's like Germany, in Weimar Republic, they were think about the people that came out of like the former German empire through the Weimar Republic, Einstein, Freud. There's a couple others that I'm not mentioning, but you guys get the gist of this. Just because a country is technologically advanced, and right now the United States is leading AI and they're leading technology. They led the third industrial revolution, and they're in the cusp of beginning to lead the fourth industrial revolution. in AI. But like I said before, we are in an AI bubble that we called in 2025. We're seeing the first stages of that right now with crypto and gold skyrocketing to the moon. But more importantly, we're seeing the Nasdaq took a dip, or like just this last month. All this stuff's happening right in this month, the first quarter, which I said we would see an AI bubble begin, or at least burst. Just because America is leading in technology and innovation doesn't necessarily mean that it won't collapse, or that the European Union won't collapse, or China won't collapse, or Russia won't collapse. So there's a lot of factors involved here, but we're trying to question and put the parallels historically, because that's how you predict the future. Is you have to understand the past. This is business strategy. This is geopolitical strategy 101. Understand where you came from, what happened historically in the past, and how that's and relate that to what's happening in the present, so that you can make predictions and strategies for the future. And that's more or less like what we're pointing out here.
So just I'm just going to bring it back to the Soviet Union right now. Again, this collapse was not centrally orchestrated. There was a reformation, which reduced the enforcement credibility. There was a fracturing of elite consensus. There was a crossing of the coordination threshold. Then there was a legal dissolution. And these combined, they removed every pillar holding the structure together. And that's what caused the total disintegration. When it comes to last century, in 1913, there was the invention of the U.S. Federal Reserve, which is not federal nor a reserve. It's private, of course, but unrestricted money printing. Mass fiat proliferation. 15 years later, 1929, as a result of that, came the stock market crisis. I forget exactly what it's called, 1929 there, which obviously was one of the 1929.
That's the stock market crash crisis. Yeah, the Great Depression.
Is it just called the crash? No, the Wall Street crash, or the Great Crash of 1929.
It's the crash of 1929, which led to the Great Depression. And it's interesting that you bring that up. Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I just want to
massively contributed, but there was also the fact there was drought, and there was also like international,
much like
international financialization, correct, globalization, correct, and that's what caused.
Yeah, there was a Dust Bowl, which led to shortages in food, famines, things of that nature, economic instability. It all
around the world
at the same time.
This is what contributed also to the Holodomor in Ukraine. This was I don't know what caused the global drought, but
probably solar maximums, solar minimums. I mean, we're not scientists, but it did happen, and it's a historical fact. And we're seeing similarities to today with certain crises, not necessarily with food shortages, but with war. Then it was ecological, it was natural shortages. Today it's man-made. So with climate change, i.e. Green New Deal, this sort of stuff. These are man-made crises versus historically in the 80s and the 20s, these are natural. They were naturally occurring crises, like but what we're dealing with today is more man-made, and this is stuff that could be avoided. So in a sense, the question that I'm invoking, or the hypothesis that I'm pointing out, is that, are we in another systematic collapse that's orchestrated in order for some kind of nefarious reason? Are the elites trying to collapse the system on purpose in order to benefit in some way? That's the question I'm asking. And that's for you guys to discuss and write about in the comments, and discuss on the Telegram channel. Links in the description, and in locals. That link is also in the description.
So just my comment on that is, and this is why the Soviet Union is so interesting. Are the elites of today, are they purposefully driving for collapse, or alternatively, are they each pursuing their own interest, and that is driving us towards collapse, because structurally, as a system, it's not a working functional system, but because it's socialist, communist, all these horrendous incentives and instruments of power. And is this what's causing or driving collapse, as opposed to a single person coordinating it. So when we saw in 2008, for example, we saw all these banks that were individually pursuing their own interest, each undermining and contributing towards the systemic collapse. But there was no individual bank saying, we are aiming to collapse the system, we expect the system to collapse. We can talk about how it was the central planning of the US government with Fannie Mae and the other one that was that kind of, and the deregulation, again, this reduction of any form of internal or like actual regulations or guidance, hollowing out with nothing to replace it. Plus, so you have these moral hazards and these government enforced distortions of market mechanisms which are undermining coherence, resulting towards collapse. And so the question is there a centralized plan saying things are collapsing, let us scheme for that, let us aim for that, or is every part of the system simply acting with their own self-interest, which is naturally against the well-being, the net well-being, the stability of the system, because it's not set up structurally to coordinate that. This is the natural criticism of liberal democracy. It's also something that, for example, Lenin wrote about 100 years ago. And I'm not a big fan of Lenin and Marxist-Leninism, but some of his critique of capitalism, when you divorce it from when we speak, when many people speak of capitalism, they talk about as this free market of voluntary exchanges. It's not really the case. We talk about this many times. It is more accurate a definition to say it's a system where the capital owning elites are the ones enforcing the power, and then they're doing exploitation and imperialism. And in the past, this imperialism tended to happen over there, and they'd bring the profits home to kind of bribe the people and enrich themselves. The loss of external empires, they've now turned in on themselves, kind of an imperial boomerang. And with the financialization, it's kind of, there's a massive parasitism from the capital owning class and the corporations and the government. And this is again that critical criticism of liberal democracy, is that there is an incentive for those in power to plunder the nation because they don't have a long-term interest in the growth of the nation. If you're in power now, take as much as you can out while you can, as opposed to, for example, if you were the king of Liechtenstein in 1655, if it was even that, your father owned the kingdom, you own the kingdom, your son's going to inherit the kingdom. You're not looking to extract and plunder as much as you can. So it's this systematic plunder of the liberal and democratic republic is, I believe, a structural characteristic. Again, it's slightly different to communism and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I'd like to also get into post-Soviet collapse or the horrors of the 90s and the early noughties. But this is something to consider. Is it elite coordinated? Well, naturally, right? At most events, most everything is elite coordinated. Is it pre-planned? Are they doing it knowingly, deliberately, consciously? Maybe. And to what extent?
I mean, basically, one of the main things that we talk about, Gorbachev was the first leader of the Soviet Union to visit the United States. And upon his visit, he came back to the Soviet Union with reforms. So these policies meant to save socialism instead of dismantle it from his perspective. And I think you actually talked about this with the Glasnost, am I pronouncing this right? Perestroika?
Perestroika.
There you go. Yeah, the economic restructuring. This broke the central planning without creating a functional market. And the Glasnost, basically the openness, where the open forum and people to communicate and publicly talk about the system and what's best for the future of the Soviet Union. This was like new to people, and this is new to Soviet people. They just did not understand it, and they felt that they were being they would become a target for being able to openly talk about the government and new reforms. So this exposed the corruption and the repression and the historical lies in the past. And you also covered this previously. And then there's the political liberalization that we were basically focusing on in this podcast. And this is the weakened party authority before a new institution were ready. So this created economic collapse and loss of ideological legitimacy, as well as the power vacuums that I discussed previously. And more importantly is the Soviet Union, they call it the Iron Curtain for a reason. During Gorbachev, there was the Chernobyl incident that's well known and historically documented. And when this accident occurred, they were very apprehensive about bringing Western powers in to help them clean it up and mitigate the damage and deal with the crisis. They felt, they were like, no, we're Soviets, we can take care of it on our own. But more importantly, there was a lot of trust issues with bringing basically Westerners into the sphere of the Soviet Union. They just did not want to do this. And there's a parallel here with communist Mao, with communist China and Mao. Mao allowed, he met with Mao party leaders met with Nixon leaders, and the purpose of that meeting was in order to basically liberalize and westernize the Chinese Republic or the Chinese country that we see today, that we're experiencing today. So they brought in Americans, Westerners, to come and modernize the economic system, industrialize, and we see the fruits and the benefits of that today in current China. Because when I visited China and worked in China, there was a common saying amongst Westerners, and they were like, dude, these people are more capitalist than we are. And it's true. I mean, if you actually go there and you do business there, and they're very, very capitalist in nature. So it did work, but they invited Westerners to come in and as mentors or like experts, and they helped build, and they brought American corporations in. The only thing that they brought in the Soviet Union, as far as I know, was just the McDonald's Corporation in Moscow. That was about it. That was the only goy slop that came into the Soviet Union. And literally, I think that was part of the problem, is that Gorbachev probably had a good idea to liberalize and westernize and change the economic system to try to build a stronger Soviet empire. The problem is that they did not invite the Westerners to come help them do that. Experts, if you will, to come in, consultants, and try to modernize it. And in that, they basically were trial and error. They were trying to create a new economic system, new liberal system, which they had no clue about, because these people were Soviet educated and they were educated under communism, the communist systems, for many generations. And this was very new to them. They just had no clue what they were doing. And without guidance and help, that's part of the reason why it collapsed. But also, I think there was a lot of infighting amongst the elites. And the elites were like, okay, if Gorbachev's opening this up and we see the system is kind of failing a little bit, and we see crisis, because the insiders know. When you know, you know. You know what I mean? You don't. And they were like, I think this system's going to collapse because these new reforms aren't going to work. And they saw the writing on the wall. They were intelligent people. They studied it. They obviously studied economic policy, political strategy, and they were like, it's time for us to look out for ourselves. And this is when they were like setting things up, setting off offshore accounts. And there was some corruption, like I said, that got exposed during this time. And they basically, the elites set themselves up for the collapse that they thought was going to be inevitable, which it was. That's my analysis on it. What do you think, Adam?
So just on that point, you said that they didn't invite Western advisors prior to the collapse. They did so post the collapse, and the Western advisors were not in good faith, we'll say. Professor Jeffrey Sachs talks about this often. He was one of those advisors brought in. He did what he thought was in the best interest of Russia. His advice was successfully implemented in Poland, which the West wanted it to succeed in. But in Russia, again, post the Soviet collapse, it didn't just collapse and all of a sudden it's like, okay, everything's fine. It collapsed. There was starvation. There was the central state dissolved. What arose in its place was many mafia states. Mafia. And they came, and when they seized the resources, and we'll get into that momentarily. But so when the Western advisors finally did come in the 90s leading into the noughties, Jeffrey Sachs talks about how he gave them advice, and it wasn't being implemented as he thought. And it was that the Western advisors and the elites coordinating that, the organizations, they were actually malevolent about it. They wanted Russia to hurt because they saw it as a defeated enemy. We won the Cold War. Let's punish Russia because they're still our rival and they're still dangerous, and we don't want them to get back off their feet. And we want to harm them. We're happy for this directed chaos, and then we can maybe step in and we can profit off that, was one of the things that they believed. And this begun to change with the rise of Vladimir Putin, who I believe has brought Russia back off from its knees. It's now standing up, and it's been able to successfully defeat, or it is in the process of defeating, but successfully stand up to the United States, all of NATO, in its coalition war in the proxy of Ukraine. Wow. I mean, like, I can criticize Vladimir Putin. I'm not going to right now, but the criticism has to be contextualized in the fact that when he took power, Russia was where it was, and now today it's where it is. Many problems, you speak to Russians and they'll complain, and this and that, and corruption and structural this, and ideology, and maybe migrants, and the war itself. Not getting into each of those points. By contrast, in Bulgaria, the country I'm in now, they've had a prime minister for a long time. He's out of power now, Boyko Borisov. And he was a former mafia, the bodyguard of the head guy, rose to power. He's in power for all this time. Very corrupt, gives contracts to his buddies, destroys rule of law, everything. And Bulgaria today, it also had similar starvation, collapse, all this in... it also communism collapsed there, broke away around that same time. It was the Socialist Republic of Bulgaria, and then became a Democratic Republic, whatever. And Bulgaria today remains the poorest EU country. It's not. I don't think it's not as bad as Albania and Bosnia Herzegovina, and it's not as bad as Ukraine. Although Ukraine was 45 million people, so there was a lot more wealth in some of the big cities than in Bulgaria, just by sheer size of things and industry. But the point is, you have to look at this in context. So liberalism. What is it? It dissolves inherited form. This dissolution can be corrective when it removes arbitrary privilege that violates truth and righteousness. Sometimes it dissolves righteous order. One of the things that does is dissolve inherited structures of order. Now, under communism, that order was not grounded in reality per se. It was in ideological communism, which wasn't fantastic, but at least there was a stability to it. There was not an effective mechanism to replace it. So what happened was instrumental instability. There was erosion, inversion, unpredictability. And again, in that collapse of enforcement of order, of law, you had the elites, yes, but like you talk about the oligarchs, a lot of the Russian oligarchs were former mafia. A lot of the oligarchs in the country I live, my understanding is former mafia. They through organized crime, that's how they made their money. Now, just one mechanism in post-Soviet collapse. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone from the Soviet Union, professor or two, my understanding is, okay, so you talk about pensions. People didn't have pensions not because they were stupid and didn't save, because they didn't have a job as we do today. That they had employment, and the state said, we will give you however they paid them, and we give you the pension, of course. When the state collapsed, when all these government jobs collapsed, the government promised pensions also collapsed, and they didn't have anything. What did happen, my understanding, is the state enterprises, like the oil companies say, I think that it was broken up into shares, and everyone was given shares, right? Everyone given a uniform number of shares. Isn't that fantastic? Then you had the collapse of the 90s, where people are starving. So, do you want to eat? Yes. Sell me your shares to the companies, the former state-owned companies. So they had to sell their shares, and this was picked up by the mafia. And I mean, I've heard some terrible stories of how bad the mafia was, especially in Russia in this time. And so this is how the oligarchs went and they built their power by collecting the shares, especially through organized crime, because people were so desperate. Times were so bad. Ordinary people had to sell their assets. The oligarchs didn't, right? They were insulated from these fallout. That's what Professor said at the beginning, because they had prime, they had assets, they'd positioned themselves prior. I mean, it got so bad that in the 90s in Russia, what the mafia would do, they would see an old lady walking home with her groceries. They would follow her home, break into her apartment, murder her and her husband, kill them both, go to the mayor, pay them a little bit, 5% of the apartment value. They would get the apartment signed into their name. Now they own an apartment. They clean it up, they rent it out. This is how they went around. And I mean, I think over 10 million Russians died in the 90s to early noughties. 10 million. That's more than most countries suffer in wars. It was horrendously brutal. I know a story. I can't say who, but there was someone I know who his father was like a musician in Russia in the 90s. The mafia, they smashed into the restaurant he was in a truck, killing people. They grabbed the band, got them on the truck, and had them sing and dance as they went around just killing people. and then this guy had to leave Russia. He's like, I can't live in a place like this. And they moved somewhere. This is how lawless it was with this collapse. It was truly a nightmare. A golden age for the mafia. And then they didn't stabilize per se. They kind of became embedded in the power because they built up. I've got all these shares, I've got all these apartments, I've now got the money. With the money, you got the power, and you can and then as the state grew in this state of lawless anarchy, a central state was able to stabilize that. Similarly, in Weimar Republic, there was an economic collapse and a social collapse, and a centralized authoritative figure was able to raise power, seize it, and stabilize it. Today, especially in the West, we're not seeing so much a lawless collapse. We're seeing a democratic collapse of law and order. It's an anomia, an anarcho-tyranny, where there's law for you and they're very harsh against you, but lawlessness for the people they're importing in order to bring things down and collapse it. It's a lot of the financial architecture and this debt-based system. This is really where there's structural components resulting in the collapse of the West is coming. It's from an abstraction, a financialization, a managerialism, really a liberal democratic republicanism in its mature and kind of later stages.
Yeah, I mean, more or less, like getting to Soviet elites personally that they benefited. I mean, that's more or less like you had broken down that a lot of mafia had gained a lot of power and influence through this power vacuum. Yeah, that definitely came after, um, but to the pre-collapse, basically mainly high-ranking officials, they converted political power into private ownership. This was part of the liberalization and the privatization that began like towards the collapse. So a lot of them became the oligarchs in the 1990s. The mafia also benefited. So like basically when the system collapsed, so to speak, lower ranking people, like mostly the thieves, what's it called? Um, I forget. There's an actual term for it, but they basically took advantage of the chaos, and they gained influence and power through the new privatization or new capital, the new system that was developing out of the ashes of the former communist system. But more or less, this like the elites benefited. They supported rapid privatization basically devastated the population because the population was not used to these reforms. It's basically was a nanny state, if you will, as most communist systems are. So why this wasn't accidental? Basically, state assets were sold cheaply. This is how the mafia benefited, so to speak. And then the legal frameworks favored insiders. Again, how mafia gained power and influence. And ordinary citizens lost savings and security. That's also what I talked about with pensions that you also broke down. So basically, in a nutshell, the collapse of rich insiders while impoverishing society as a whole, and a classic elite exit strategy is where I'm getting at to the point on this.
So just to repeat what you said there, a transformation from political power to private ownership. What are we seeing today all over, right? One comment, can you get the comment up? Can I? One comment says that the Western collapse will be a lot different than the USSR because the USSR was a closed society. We in the West are a liberal democratic republic. So what we're doing in the West is rather than simply harming the ordinary citizens through these mechanisms, we're importing aliens, and then that again, it's much more subversive, financialized. The mass importation of alien peoples suppresses wages, pushes up asset prices. We're just printing money, and that's really what's causing these economic crises. The stripping of purchasing power away from the have-nots to the capitalist class, to the elites. It doesn't have to be done with such overt instruments. It's just printing. So much printing. Again, this is what caused that great crash of 1929. There's factors, of course, but it stems a lot from the Federal Reserve, 1913. We're now 100 years on from that. 1929, 2026, 100 years on, and we've become more sophisticated. And with quantitative easing, we don't need to. You don't need to clip coins anymore. You just need the government to keep printing money and giving out fraudulent benefits and buying bonds with invented money and lending out 10, 15 times the money that the banks hold, fractional reserve. So the advanced sophistication of fiat, of this debt-based monetary empire, is so efficient at causing these conditions. It really is today a directed chaos, not spontaneous. This is not an accident; it's a governance technique.
Yeah, I mean, more or less, like what you said, it's controlled chaos. Like we're in the decline. We're technically in a collapse. We're in like what I call the sorry, the super secret collapse, recession, or super secret depression, greater economic depression. This is global, by the way. So DC also commented. He said people in actual communist countries like the DPRK and the USSR, people were far more involved with government compared to the American counterparts. The politicians in America won't want normies to stay in power.
That comment continues. The politicians in America want normies to stay away from politics and only vote so that the circus called democracy can continue. That was DC's comment.
Yeah.
And this is one of the critiques which was identified 100 years ago by an Austrian painter with a funky mustache. He said that for democracy, you have these two wings of the same bird, and they're marching along, especially to the financial interest. But really, it's just you're being controlled. This is a dialectical. They're moving, kind of that way, but still in the same direction. And that direction benefits the actual elite, the finances, and not the people, and not the state. And again, this is there's a lot of things that I may not agree with. I certainly don't agree with fascism or socialism, communism, but a lot of their critiques here actually do hold. in these certain situations when it comes to the critique of power, because what happens in the West is we're told we live in a democracy and it's the best system and you're sovereign, and you're not. It's all just dressing up of how things actually are. And so when you have these leftist critiques of power, of Western power, actually there's truth in that, even though their solutions I don't agree with.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that ooh, this is what happens when a system comes to its final conclusion. Um, it's controlled chaos, and it gets to a point where, I mean, think about like when you go into debt, like, or someone that's in debt rather, they start borrowing to pay the debt, and they borrow more to pay the debt, and then like eventually they start selling assets or accumulating assets, and then in very crazy situations or unethical situations they start hiding assets, and then they start preparing for the inevitable. You know, this happened during the 2008 fiasco. A lot of people basically just stopped paying their rent. They stopped paying their mortgages. They had like 3 or 4 different mortgages, and they basically were starting to hoard stuff, and like they just skipped town basically. I mean, that's more or less, I think, what's going on. Not right now per se, but like that's what happened in the Soviet Union, is that people that had access and power, they were looking out for themselves towards the end because they saw the end was near. But I think that by that reason, I think it was salvageable. I think that they could have brought in reforms, and they could have transitioned the government from the Soviet Union towards the end, 89. They could have salvaged it. They could have transitioned it. They could have just basically consolidated like they were doing, and republics that wanted to be independent, like Gorbachev was doing, go your separate ways. That's fine. We'll consolidate to a smaller, more manageable, continent. Or, I mean, it's pretty much a continent. It's most of Asia. Soviet Union took up most of Asia, and yeah.
Interestingly, like many people say, like Ukraine voted to leave the Soviet Union. That's not strictly true. They were told, you're not voting to leave, you're voting for autonomy. And they said, all right, well, I don't want to leave. Autonomy sounds good. But most people like to twist that and say they voted to leave and dissolve the union. It's not strictly true. Now, 1911, a quote from a French-English writer, politician, historian, Hilaire Belloc. The whole of the party system is not merely controlled, but actually created by the great financial interests. The professional politician is their servant. He cannot act against them. He dare not even understand them. He mouths the phrases of popular government, but his actions are dictated by those who pay for the machine by which he lives. Parliament has thus become a place where words are free, but decisions are bound. This really is, again, 1911. These critiques are absolutely correct. We don't live in a free market with a government by the people, for the people, of the people. All of that is a hilarious fiction. Don't believe it, of course. Power is not neutral, and they hate you.
Interesting. What do you think? I mean, final conclusion, like in parallels. What do you think is going to be in the future? Within the next 5 years, by 2030. How do you think Russia, United States, China, Europe, EU is going to fare? We talked about a lot of this in our previous podcast, but there's always times for readjustment and reassessment of what's going on as we continue through the decline.
So I see the world today, the West today, is a lot more sophisticated and subversive, right? They don't have to make such an explicit direct action. They just chip away, progressive, continuous. And I think that's terrible. So what I think is going to happen, we see that two ways they love pushing, coordinating this collapse is by printing money and by justifying further government spending. And wealth redistribution. So the best way they've done this is manufacturing wars. The Washington and London have manufactured this war, the hope to harm Moscow. It's harmed Moscow. It's harmed Kiev. It's harmed all of Europe. America is a lot more insulated from the immediate fallouts of this war. And people say, it's good. We're harming our rival Russia. Why does it have to be? I think the whole thing's quite evil. But certainly, I think that we've been saying that the war is over, but it still may continue. We said, will it collapse by the last spring? But by the last fall, it didn't. They're still fighting. It's still continuing, grinding on. Will it be this autumn or next autumn? I just don't see it continuing beyond that. So now we've got, let's call it November 2027. I don't think it can continue beyond that. I could be wrong. This is just, this is what I hear from others as well, whom I follow and listen to. So the war's over. Does that mean spending stops? No, they keep printing money because they have to. They're pushing for, they say we're gonna push towards war with Russia, or war with China, and all our goals are for 2032. Like, okay, well, that's far enough in the future that you can spend money on it, justify higher spending, and say to your population, you need to accept lower living standards so that we can, up our defense. And really it's so we can up the spending on the defense contractors whom we have shares in. We are using our political power to enrich ourselves through the private ownership of shares. We're printing money, eroding your purchasing power, suppressing your wage, increasing our share capital in this way, eroding your position, your freedom. And then we're going to go and get journalists to complain that you're buying fruit juices and rotisserie chickens. You should be eating spinach and kale and lab-grown meat. So I see that staples of meat and job stability and being able to support your family with a job and not struggle and not being in debt, all these things I see as declining. More instability, more debt for the underclass, greater social tension as the elites continue doing what they do, which is continuing to coordinate and manage decline and enrich themselves at your expense, a systematic plunder of the market society. There's a great phrase that says, my country is not your economic zone. Sorry, it is the economic zone. It's a market society to the elite. That's how they see it. And that, once you understand how they perceive, that I think is really, then you understand their behavior. Alongside that, there is geopolitics and the progressive linear technological advancement. I am gravely concerned that, and you go check Polymarket right now, they say, what's the likelihood of a war against Iran by June of this year? 50%. It's not financially recommend it, but the prediction market, people are saying, I think it's as likely as not that this year, war with Iran.
I'm going to, one last question. I'm going to close with this. So DC asked, oligarchs nowadays are globalists, so they don't call any country home. If America is effed, they will move to Russia or some other country that is doing all right, starting in America as well. Yeah, I mean, basically, this is like a lot of nomads are doing this. A lot of like wealthier people are doing the dual passport thing. But a lot of countries right now, a lot of governments are fighting back against that, and they're starting to do away with the dual passport because people are traveling and taking money and transferring and things of that nature. And we saw a lot of that with the Ukraine-Russian conflict. A lot of Russians were fleeing with money to different countries when they got sanctioned by SWIFT. So they were pulling out their dollars and they were physically taking it to other countries to deposit. And that was a flight of money, as well as intellectuals. Ukraine, however, it was a lot more difficult. They did lock down the borders right away as soon as the war started, which was kind of interesting. And I believe they're still locked down today. So you can't leave without any type of Prother authorization, because of the conscription and things of that nature. That being said, yeah, it's interesting situation. And like I said, to understand what's going on now and what's going to happen in the future, it's important to understand the historical geopolitical spectrum of the last 100 years. And even further back than that, you go back to classics, Roman, Greek, but it's more relevant to use a modern historical context to understand, like, and interpret exactly what we're seeing right now. Yeah, thanks guys for joining us. Remember, like and subscribe. Join Locals. Rumble 3 gets you $3 off your first month's membership on my Locals channel. Visit Adam Maxwell's Locals. His links in the link tree, I think, in my description. I think on his description on his channel as well. That being said, thanks guys to our affiliates, and I guess join us on Telegram. If you want to discuss further about anything like this or anything that we discuss on the podcast. And let's grow the channel, and let's get some more let's get some more interesting discussions. I do have I did reach out to a couple of influencers recently. One got back to me, so I will be bringing some guests on here in the near future, the next couple of weeks. And look forward. I got Swen, we might be doing something on Saturday or on the weekend. Might doing some a new topic or a new discussion. But like I said, I've got a lot of people that are going to be coming on, guests and whatnot in the future. So thank you guys. And we're going on that hour. Take care, and good night.